All right, if it's all right with you, I'm gonna start to let people in.
Oh, please go right ahead. And if they is a chat ahead of time, that's fine.
Okay, great. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. We'll be getting started in about 5 minutes, but welcome to our Zoom tonight. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We'll be here in the chat just for a couple more minutes before we go live on Facebook and get started around 6:30. Hello, everyone who's joining in. Thanks so much for logging on tonight for Green Drinks. Nancy Moldenhauer, our normal host, is off for the evening. She had other commitments as Michigan City Ward. So I'm Em Racine, and I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator for Save the Dunes. So thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. We'll wait a couple more minutes and then we'll get started. All right. Well, we're here at 6:30 in the Zoom. So I'd like to thank everybody for joining us this evening. Just a couple of Zoom housekeeping notices before we get started. I'll also be going on Facebook Live, so it'll be a little transitional, but thank you for joining us this evening. And this video is being recorded. And once we do go live on Facebook, I will be changing everyone's permissions to not be able to unmute themselves, so that just if you guys have questions or comments, please feel free to use the chat for any of those. And Ken, just a second, I'm going to go ahead and go live on Facebook and then we'll get started. All right. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining us this evening for Northwest Indiana Green Drinks. Whether you're joining us on Zoom or on Facebook Live, we're really happy to see everyone tonight digitally. We'd like to give a quick shout out to Northwest Indiana Green Drinks sponsors, which include Save the Dunes, Michigan City Sustainability Commission, and 219 Green Connect. Tonight's hosts for our presentation are 95.1 FM AM and 1420 WIMS radio, the Dunes Learning Center, and Indiana University Northwest, Indiana University Press, and Amazon Books. Tonight, we are thrilled to welcome Ken Schoon, PhD in Northwest Indiana native, author of many books, and Professor Emeritus of Science Education, to present his Duneland Dynamics. This presentation is being recorded and streaming on Facebook. All viewers are muted. The recording will be shared on our Save the Dunes YouTube channel at the end. So if you couldn't make it tonight and you're watching this later on YouTube, or if you love the presentation and would love to share it with your networks, that's very appreciated. We love to share this far and wide. We also send out the recordings attached to our monthly e-newsletter from Save the Dunes. So feel free to subscribe to that and stay up to date with Save the Dunes. And I believe that after our July Green Drinks break, all Green Drinks communications will be coming directly from Save the Dunes. So better to join now and see what's going on in Northwest Indiana. I will hand the mic over to our presenter, Ken. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start by saying something you're not expecting. The dunes are not special. There are sand dunes all over the world. I spent part of January, more than half of January, in Egypt. I saw lots of sand dunes. They're not necessarily special. However, the Indiana dunes are very special. It's more than the sand, it's the whole geographic area, of course. But not everybody agreed with that at the beginning. Some of you may be familiar with Tipton, Indiana. It's named after John Tipton, who was a pioneer in this state, and he was active with state government and was in charge of roads and highways, as they were in the 1800s. And he chaired the Committee on Roads and Canals. Then he helped set the Indiana and Illinois boundary. The state government decided where it would be. It actually, the boundary between Indiana and Illinois is a straight line that if you followed it straight south, you would end up in Vincennes, Indiana, at the state capitol building. But this is what he said about the Indiana dunes. These ponds, marshes, and sandhills can never admit of settlement, nor will ever be of much service to our state. The Chesterton Tribune, still in press, in 1890 wrote this: "Without one bit of exaggeration, the dune country is the most godforsaken place in the state of Indiana. In the midst of sandhills, swamps, and sloughs, its headquarters for malaria, sandburrs, and bullfrogs." It amazes me that malaria and bullfrogs are equally bad as far as this sentence seems to indicate. Kind of amazing. In the same year, Henry Chandler Coles was quoted as saying, "The Indiana dunes are a common meeting ground of trees and wildflowers from all directions." He said this 134 years ago, and it's amazing how that part is still so important today. William Blatchley, who's a geologist and the state geologist back in the 1890s, finally wrote this: "There's no better place for an extended botanical study of a limited area in the state than among the dunes, swamps, peat bogs, prairies, and river bottoms of this area." So you see, at first, there was mixed opinion as to how valuable the dunes were. At very first, the dunes weren't even in Indiana, they were in Michigan. But when Indiana became a state in 1816, they talked Congress into moving the boundary north by 10 miles, not so that they could include the dunes, but so that they could have more beach, more shoreline, location for a port or something of that sort. Nobody at that time was thinking of national parks because they didn't exist yet. So why are they special? Why do I say they're very special? Well, the answer for that is basically dependent on the geography and the geology of the area, two of my favorite subjects. Here, the yellow dot, of course, notes where we are and where you are and where the Indiana dunes are. But if you think of this area before there were states, the boundary line between Indiana and Illinois is close to the boundary line between the forested area of North America and the prairies. It's said, I don't know if it's true or not, that a squirrel in Northwest Indiana could climb a tree and jump from tree to tree to tree to tree to tree to tree all the way to the Atlantic Ocean without ever needing to go down to the ground and walk from one tree to the next. That's pretty amazing. But Illinois isn't like that. Now, of course, the boundary doesn't mean the forests end at the boundary line, but the area to the east of that boundary, the Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and so forth, are mainly woodland, and to the left, the west part, is mainly prairie. When you think of Nebraska, you don't think of the forests like we have around Indiana, or had, particularly when we became a state. Iowa is one of the prairie states. Illinois' nickname is the Prairie State. And so what that means is that we have the forests to the east, we have the grassland to the west, and where does that leave the dunes? In the central forest grasslands transition ecoregion. In other words, we have both forests and grasslands in the dunes area and in western Indiana and eastern Illinois. But we also have plants in the dunes that came down from the Arctic region during the Ice Age. One of those is the tamarack tree, the larch. We also have plants that come from the Indiana desert, the North American desert. And the most common of those is the prickly pine cactus. As I mentioned, I was in Egypt for part of this year, and the only plant in Egypt that I recognized was the prickly pear cactus, or a close relative to it. Now, for those of you who have heard earlier talks of mine, or you've studied the geology some other way, the area close to Lake Michigan, if you want to know how old the land is, it depends on where you are. And that's because of the early geology of this area. The Valparaiso Moraine is south of Michigan, Michigan City. I hope you can see my cursor when I do this. But the Valparaiso Moraine is south and southeast of Michigan City. And that's the oldest landscape we have around here. It's more than 15,000 years old. But as we move north from there and towards the lake, there's the Tinley Moraine, which is a little newer. The Lake Border Moraine, which includes the location of the Indiana Dunes Environmental Learning Center, known today as the Dunes Learning Center, and it's younger still. And then the Glenwood shoreline was formed about 14,500 years ago. So it's newer, younger than the Valparaiso Moraine. Newer than that is the Calumet shoreline, which through much of Porter County follows Route 12, and in Lake County, where I live, follows Ridge Road. And then the Tolleson shoreline, which butts up against the current shoreline. And way over to the west, not visible in the Michigan City area, but is in from Miller Beach west into Chicago, way at the far left side of the map is the Dune and Swale landscape. And I'm just as guilty as everybody else calling it Dune and Swale. That's the official name of the Shirley Hines property there. But it's a shame. I've taken people through that area and they ask when we finish, where were the dunes? And if it had been called the Ridge and Swale landscape, people would have known that it isn't dune land, it's sort of ridges. So the thing to learn from all of that is that older landscapes are further away from Lake Michigan. That's part of the answer. Why we have so many different plants here. But Henry Chandler Coles, in his PhD dissertation, discovered that plant communities predictably change with time. And the older landscapes that are further from the lake have had more time for the landscape to change than the Tolleson shoreline or the current beach, which has only plants that are very, very new. So because of Coles, this area is referred to as the birthplace of American ecology. Ecology did exist in Europe, but not much of a science. But as far as the study in the United States is concerned, it's at the Indiana Dunes where that work got started. There are a lot of different kinds of landscapes in the dunes, and that's one of the reasons why we have so many different kinds of plants. We have the dunes themselves. And by the way, in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see the photographer who took this picture. And I did that throughout because many of these pictures were not taken by me. The beach, the shoreline, the foredunes, blowouts, forests, prairies, wetlands, savannas. This is everybody knows what a beach is. Everybody knows what a woodland or a forest is, and everybody knows what a prairie is. But lots of people do not know what a savanna is. And a savanna is sort of halfway between, this is a simple answer, halfway between a prairie and a forest. There are trees in a savanna, but they're far enough apart that sunlight can come down and bathe the floor. And in a heavy forest, the sunlight hardly gets ever a chance to spend much time on the ground. Then this is the dune and swale that I think should have been called ridge and swale. And if you look carefully, and I don't know if you can see my cursor, but here's one of the ridges in the lower left-hand corner of the photograph. And then out here is another ridge. Then there's another valley. And then there's another ridge out here. And they're all parallel with this picture, with each other. Kim Swift, some of you know from her work with the National Lakeshore. But each of these is a former shoreline of Lake Michigan. And between each of the beaches is a low marshy area, and the ridges have different kinds of plants than the marshes have. So here we have the Indiana Dunes region, and our national park itself, because of its different geology and different geography, we have more than 12,000. Whoops, that shouldn't have happened. We have 12,000 different species of ferns and flowering plants in the national park itself. And if you go beyond the national park, you'll get a higher number, of course. We have 28 orchids, 28 different varieties or species of orchids in the dunes. The entire state of Hawaii, which sells orchids to the mainland, has 3 varieties or species of orchids. The dunes have 28. We have 600 fungi species, if anybody cares, but biologists certainly do, and so do a number of other folk. We have 46 different mammals who live in the dunes, 18 different amphibians, 23 different kinds of reptiles, 60 different species of butterflies, 71 species of fish, and 350 species of birds. The reason for the birds being so high is because they migrate. So this includes those that are here in the summertime and those that are here in the winter who may be in Canada during the summer. So our national park is thus one of the most biologically diverse national parks in the entire country. And the shoreline itself is also the oldest part of Indiana that was explored or peopled by folks from Europe. The first that we know of was Jacques Marquette in 1675. And Marquette came on his way home on his last trip, came along the shoreline, stopping. He got into Lake Michigan at the Grand Calumet River and probably stopped for the night near Dunes Creek, where the state park is, and probably stopped again at Michigan, where Michigan City is today, near Trail Creek. And of course, there are stories that Marquette went up and blessed a spring that is named in his honor today. But the truth is, at this point in his life, he was so ill that his 2 accomplices, you could say servants or men that were going with him, had to lift him into and out of the canoe. We know that much. We also know that he would have preferred to have the strength and the gusto that the statue of him has at Marquette Park in Gary. After Marquette, there were many coureurs de bois, or fur traders, French fur traders, who fanned out in the area and trapped mink and muskrat and beaver, and also traded with the Indians, who also did trapping for them. We know that there was Le Petit Fort in the Dunes area, and it was probably near Lake Michigan, probably pretty close to Trail Creek. And so not terribly far from the pavilion and that area, but we don't know exactly where it is because it was a wooden building. We're talking about something that was well over 250 years old, and it was wood. There was no stone foundation or anything of that sort. So any trace of it would have been lost unless something was buried. This is not a photograph, of course, of that. It's actually a photograph of a building in Pennsylvania, but it was built to resemble the forts. You notice there's a stockade around the area and a grassy area in the middle. The stockade was in existence. We have reports of American soldiers who saw it, but it wasn't to keep out the enemy. It was to keep out the deer from their garden. And people today still put up fences to keep the deer out of their vegetable gardens. Our British connection started in 1763 with the French and Indian War. And after the war started, one of the most famous people who lived in Indiana Dunes, Jean-Baptiste Point de Sable, had his inn, his trading post was very close to where the International Friendship Gardens, and I know it's got a new name, I think it's the International Biologic Gardens today, must be where he had his trading post. He was a Frenchman, probably not from France, but probably from Haiti, but he came into this area by way of Quebec and Montreal. During the Revolutionary War, we had actually a battle that took place here because folks were looking for the Le Petit Fort because they did want to hide behind that stockade. And you can't see Michigan in this map, but way up above Trail Creek in this area here was a fort that the French built. And then after the War of 1812, excuse me, after the war, the French and Indian War, it was maintained by British troops, and American patriots went up that way, stole a bunch of pelts, beaver pelts and muskrat and that from the fort because it was unguarded when they arrived, and they were coming back towards Illinois when they finally were caught up by the British who were running the fort but didn't happen to be there when the Americans arrived. And so a battle took place between the folks who were basically on the American side and the folks on the British side. And there was the Battle of Trail Creek is, of course, on Trail Creek in Michigan City, and it gives the date December 5th, 1780. And if you go to Dune State Park, you'll see another marker that has the same date, the same battle, but it mentions Le Petit Fort, which is close to the Dunes Creek area. And we really don't know which location, because we have two different reports of that battle, both written by the British, and they refer to the stream, but they don't say which stream because they hadn't been named yet. And so it's kind of funny that LaPorte County has its monument and Porter County has its monument to the same battle. Interestingly, the Americans were led by a man whose name was Tom Brady, and Lieutenant Tom Brady. And it's fair to say that Lieutenant Tom Brady was a patriot because he was fighting for the American side. Long before Tom Brady, who's much more famous, was a patriot because that was the nickname of his football team. And on we go. After that battle took place, the Spanish from San Luis, which is now known as St. Louis, came up and did the same thing. And they came up this way from Illinois, went into Fort St. Joseph. The British were again out hunting. Nobody was guarding the place. But what they did was take down the British flag, put up their flag. The next morning, they took down their flag and they left. They were gone long before the British got back from their hunting expedition. But they did then the Spanish did go to the Treaty of Paris and asked that what is now Indiana and Michigan and Ohio and Illinois be part of Spain. But they didn't have enough weight, and that never happened. So by 1805, Michigan territory was separated from the Indiana territory, now that all of this is American property. And notice that the Dune State Park and Dunes Creek here and Trail Creek, all of that is in Michigan territory, not in Indiana territory. And as I noted earlier, when we became a state, Michigan was not a state, so they had no representation. They had no voting representation in Congress. And Indiana said, we want to move the boundary north by 10 miles. And Congress said, sure. And so we did. In 1822, the first European settlers, in this case, Canadian settlers, came down. And that, of course, was the Bailey family, Joseph Bailey. And they established their trading post on the lake border moraine, just north of the Little Calumet River. In 1850, the first railroads came through, and LaPorte County was the first place up this area that had a railroad in Indiana. Because the railroads came from Detroit, they followed the southern part of Michigan. Because it was a Detroit, Michigan train system, they wanted the route to be in Michigan as long as it could be. But once they got pretty close to Lake Michigan, they had to come south of the lake and through Michigan City. And this red brick building you see behind the train is the Michigan City Depot at that time. That was the Michigan Central Railroad. Another Michigan Railroad was the Michigan Southern and Lakeshore Railroad. And they raced to see which one would get to Chicago first. And it was the Michigan Central that did. Coming up, if you take the South Shore from Michigan City to Chicago, you'll actually follow the Michigan Central Illinois Central Railroad line up to the downtown area in Chicago. Once the railroads were here, the dunes were no longer protected by nature. They had to be protected by people, and people weren't doing it at first. So sand mining became a major operation. This is a photo of an advertisement: clean drift, Lake Michigan core sand for sale. And a great deal of sand was removed from the area. This is called Dune Park, but Dune Park is not where the Michigan is not where the South Shore Station is today. That is called Dune Park. This area was basically what is today Bethlehem Steel, now Cleveland Cliffs. And here's a picture of Michigan City's tallest sand dune, said to be the tallest sand dune at the south end of Lake Michigan, which was the Hoosier Slide. And at the bottom of the dune, you can see all these railroad cars, because what was happening is that people loved that sand because it made money. They could make money by selling it. And there were lots of people who wanted to buy it. The entire city of Chicago was one of the biggest customers of Indiana sand. Grant Park, Lincoln Park, Jackson Park are all built on Indiana sand that was dumped into the lake next to the shore. Another major industry in the early days near the dunes, this could be Long Lake, is ice cutting. Notice that the men have saws, and they cut the ice into large rectangles and then slid it over to the shore, where it was put into an ice house and buried with sawdust and insulated as well as they could with all that sawdust, and then taken out in the summertime and sold to people who wanted ice for their ice boxes. The Etna powder plant found a really interesting use for the Indiana dunes. They protected other people from explosions. Etna made gunpowder and dynamite, and there were a number of explosions where there was just an accident and a building would blow up. But because of the unevenness of the ground, if you were behind one of the sand dunes, then you weren't bothered by the explosion. Of course, if you were not behind the sand dune, but in front of it, it didn't help you at all. The Michigan City No, it's the it's the Miller Beach cemetery has one section of its cemetery that is a mass grave of men who were killed during one of the explosions here. But an interesting purpose for the dunes was to protect them. Not protecting the dunes, but to protect the development. So from 1850 to 1910, there was a great deal of development. From 1910 to 1966 was sort of a fight between those people who were favoring development and those people who were favoring conservation of the dunes. And luckily, from 1966 to the present, the goal of sustainable development is paramount to development today. We want sustainable development. People coming in with big businesses don't want to tear down the dunes anymore. They don't want to sell Indiana Dunes State Park and put in another steel mill, which was talked about at one time. They want clean air. They want clean water. They want the national park just as much as everybody else in this area. So businesses and industry and conservationists since 1966 have really been working together, and that's really wonderful. Jens Jensen designed a number of the parks. He was a landscape architect in Chicago, and he wrote, and I'll read, "The dunes of northern Indiana are almost within a stone's throw of perhaps one of the greatest industrial communities of the world. It's the only landscape of its kind within reach of the millions," and he's quite correct, millions of people that need its softening influence for the restoration of their souls and the balance of their minds. In 1916, he was saying, we need to protect those Indiana dunes and keep them for the people. Dale Enquist was the superintendent of the Dune National Park, actually the Lakeshore at the time, and he wrote that our relationship with Save the Dunes Council are very good. We're generally mutually supportive. Generally, you notice. We have an ultimate goal that is the same. We differ sometimes on methods and procedures. I view them personally as a kind of conscience. I like to think I'd always keep uppermost in my mind the preservation goals for the Indiana Dunes. With the Save the Dunes Council out there, you can be assured that should you ever think of straying from the pure path, you will be quickly reminded. And he couldn't have written that if he hadn't at some point strayed from the pure path and been quickly reminded. So we can have continual sustainable development only if we have eternal vigilance and paying attention to the dunes. And that's where Save the Dunes Council comes in. And as many of you know, it was formed in 1952. It was formed in 1952 by Dorothy Buell, and at first it was all women. As Charlotte Reed nicely said for the video that we put together a couple of years ago, she said, and the women had the sense to invite men to join the dunes, Save the Dunes as well. But eternal vigilance has been an important thing of that organization, and they have even been purchasing property, as many of you know that better than I do. There's been since the 1960s a big change that I am so proud of, and I'm glad that I'm actually a part of it. The Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore was a dream of the superintendent, Dale Enquist, also of Mark Reshkin, who was the chief scientist for the park, and Lee Botts, who is one of the most engaging persons I have known to be able to ask people to do almost anything, and they would say yes. And I was one of those in that category. She had such a wonderful reputation and had done so much herself. If she asked me for any help, I gave it to her. And the reason there's no picture right here is that she asked me to put together a book that would be a complement to the Shifting Sands video that she was the producer of. And I was a little surprised when she asked, but uh, I was pleased to be asked and glad to be able to put that together. So I was trying to rush, but thinking that I needed to save some time at the end for questions as well and stay within our 45 minutes. So uh, were there any hands that came up or questions?
Well, Ken, we did get one question on Facebook, so we'll go there first. But everyone
Oh,
else in the
oh,
Zoom and on Facebook Live, if you have any questions, either raise your hand in the chat and we can unmute you and you can ask directly, or drop them in the chat here on Zoom and we'll get to them as we go. So the first question that we had asked on Facebook was, with there being so many ecosystems, forest, prairie, etc., just south of Lake Michigan, how would I know what plants were native to our location in outside of Chesterton? So maybe some good resources on native plants. Obviously, Save the Dunes has our native pollinator guy, but Ken, please feel free to answer that.
Yeah, I don't think anybody has published a list of the native plants, and by native, um, they're really talking about the plants that were already here before European settlement. So that would be before the 1820s. Uh, first of all, of course, nobody was writing them down before the 1820s. Nobody was writing them down really before the 1920s. That's probably not true, but 1880s would be it wouldn't be as good a list as we have now. Also, what is native is a question, and what you should consider because of climate change. Our winters are warmer than they used to be. The last two winters were obviously warmer than they used to be. But when I looked at a fairly recent, no longer accurate, but let's say maybe 10 years ago, I was looking at a Department of Agriculture zone map of the United States, of the agricultural zones. We were in a zone that was defined as being at least once a year, the temperature gets down to 20 degrees below zero. I've only known that to happen twice in the last 30 years. Certainly not any, it's been, who knows, not in my lifetime do I remember it being the average is 20 degrees below zero. And so obviously the map needed to be updated, and it has been updated. But what about plants in Kentucky that were native before climate change, and the seeds that blew across the Ohio River and landed on the Indiana side? And in the past, it would be too cold, and so they'd get killed. But it's not too cold anymore, and they are surviving, and they are growing in Indiana, and they are listed as aliens. But they didn't come here and because of human change, they came here because of climate change. So should they be rooted out and thrown away? My guess is no. But that opinion is not necessarily universal.
Thank you for that answer. Okay, we've got another one in the chat here. Please tell the story of Diana of the Dunes. Do you feel like you'd like to?
Oh, I can do that. I should have a picture of Diana, shouldn't I? First of all, her name wasn't Diana. And there are a number of misconceptions and misdescriptions, if that's a fair thing to say. She was not a doctor's daughter, but she was a Chicagoan, and she was a very bright woman. She went to the University of Chicago. She studied in Germany. She came back to Chicago, and apparently being a bright woman at the turn of the century was not something that people recognized. She could still see men get jobs that she was better qualified for. And at some point, she decided she had had enough of Chicago. She got on the South Shore train. So we know it was after 1906, because that's when the South Shore was extended to Porter County. And she took the train to the South Shore station, got off,
No six.
and walked north to the dunes. And the South Shore station at that point was at Tremont, which is sort of, people actually say that the dunes are at Tremont. There was no no state park at the time. And I don't know if she had a blanket. We know she brought probably a suitcase or something. She found a place to sleep, and she spent the next, I don't remember now, 10, 15 years, I think, in the dunes. She wasn't exactly a hermit. She would talk to people. She got to know a number of the folks who lived in the area. Many of you, if you've been to the Dunes Learning Center and you go up on Howe Road, just as you get to the Dunes Learning Center entrance, there's a yellow house to your right. That house was owned by a Swedish family who who liked Diana of the Dunes. And Diana would often stop there and have a cup of coffee or some cookies or something of that sort. She had what it's called, a library card, and she could go to the Chesterton library and check books out, and she was an avid reader. I mean, she was a college graduate. But she didn't want to ever move back to Chicago, and she didn't. Other people who lived in the dunes and hermits got to know her. The problem, her biggest problem occurred when a person was on a boat in Lake Michigan and they saw her taking a bath. And most people, when they take a bath, take their clothes off first. And he was far enough away and that she probably thought she wasn't being seen. But being a hermit and only having so much clothing, she probably didn't want to get her clothes all wet. But anyway, she was bathing in Lake Michigan, and he told reporters that when he got back to Chicago. Chicago Tribune sent out reporters, and they started hounding her, trying to find her. They wanted photographs of her. They wanted to know who this woman was. They came up with the name Diana of the Dunes because Diana was the Greek goddess of the hunt and of the moon. And Diana, of course, had to fend for herself and find her own food and know which plants were poisonous and which ones weren't, and things of that sort. But she lived there for years. But this was before Burns Ditch was built, so you could walk along the beach, and there was, nobody out there. Dunes, the Ogden Dunes area was being developed at the time. The Boy Scouts had a cabin up near the lake. And I remember being told that the Boy Scouts were told, if you see this woman, stay away from her. She wasn't dangerous, but that's where she lived, and she eventually died at the dunes. And she was buried in a cemetery in Gary, in Glen Park.
Well, thank you for sharing that story. There is a couple other.
And by the way, I hate to interrupt, but there's a book about her that was written wonderfully. It was published by the History Press, and it describes her life in much more detail. And it's a fascinating story of the adventures she had in the years that she lived there. I'm sorry I interrupted.
No, it's okay. Thank you. The next question I have is, I live on the Valparaiso Moraine in LaPorte County. Are there plants here that are not found in any other moraines or shorelines?
I am a geologist. A botanist could answer that question, perhaps. I assume there are. but I have no idea. I couldn't give you any specifics.
All right. Then just some other, great comments saying thank you, great presentation, Ken. Um,
Oh, thank you.
if there's any other questions, we still have some time to answer them. So, we've got a couple people here still in the Zoom chat. Please feel free to drop any questions, or if you'd like to ask, you can raise your hand and I'd be happy to unmute you.
I have a number of books that I have written that are for sale at uh, the gift shop on Route 49. And I encourage people to buy their books there because uh, about 40% of the sale price goes to support uh, tourism and the like in the Dunes area. But one of them is the one that you and I talked about before this program started, and that was Dreams of Duneland, which is not exactly a picture book. It has wonderful pictures in it, but it also has uh, detailed stories and a history of the Dunes area.
Amazing. So we'll maybe leave a couple more minutes to oh wait, we got another question. Some more questions. Love this.
Okay.
Thank you, guys. Have there ever been bears or wolves in the dunes?
Had there ever been what?
Bears or wolves?
The answer is yes. I don't recall any stories of bears, but wolves were all over this area at the time, not just in the dunes, but back in the moraine and the former beach areas between Lake Michigan shoreline today and the original shoreline. Wolves were feared, and the government at one point had uh, they paid you for every dead body, every dead wolf you brought in. So it was encouraging hunters to shoot and kill the wolves. And of course, that's one of the reasons why the deer have become overpopulated in this area, because their natural predator is no longer here, but they used to be.
Very cool. Okay, I've got another question about the Valparaiso Moraine. Who
Mhm.
named it and when?
Who named it? I'm pretty sure that the Valparaiso Moraine was named by the same man who named the various shorelines, the Glenwood shoreline, the Calumet, and the Tolliston shoreline. Um, Now I got to think of his name. It's one of the reasons I carry this book around. Uh, Calumet Beginnings was my first book of this general vicinity, talking about the glacier area. And his name was Frank Leverett. In 1897 is when most of those names came out. And the reason the Tolliston shore, and one of the things that geologists do is name things after places. They don't name things after people. They would never say that the Valparaiso Dunes, we're going to rename it the Coles uh, the Coles Dunes or the Coles Moraine or something or other, named after a person. They always name it after a place because the place will probably still be here 150 years from now. And some people even change their names. So the Tolliston shoreline, which is the one on Route 12 through most of, let's say from Michigan City, most of the way towards Chesterton, was named Tolliston because there was a city or a town called Tolliston, in what is now Gary. But when the steel mills came in and the city of Gary was established and grew, Gary merged with Tolliston, and the name Tolliston went off the maps, but not the geologic maps that talk about the shoreline.
Very interesting. Thank you for answering that. Okay, we've got another question. Can you find any precious stones in the dunes?
I have not, but it again depends on what you call precious. Um, Up at Lake Michigan, you often find uh, what I call beach pebbles. Uh, they're round, they're smooth, but not smooth like glass. They're smooth. You're gonna laugh. They're smooth like sandpaper. You can feel a texture there. They're not round like a ball. They're round like a, a basketball that is deflated, maybe. Um, and they're common around the dunes, and kids will often pick them up and take them home. And uh, sometimes people, I don't know if they're supposed to, but they'll take a bunch of them to put them on the bottom of an aquarium that they have at home. Well, along Ridge Road in Munster, there was a oil pipeline that went under the ground, of course, as pipelines do, that sprung a leak near Ridge Road. And the power company, or the BP, sent a crew out there, and they had to dig through the sand to get down to the pipeline. When that happened, there were families with metal detectors trying to see if they could get any old material from the early settlement of that area. What I found in that sand, this is way down below the ground, were beach pebbles on Ridge Road, miles south of the beach, but right next to where the beach used to be 12,000 years ago. And that was, to me, that was a precious stone. But I
I'd
couldn't
say,
sell it. I
I'd say a
suppose I could make a
12,000.
ring out of it.
Yeah, I'd say a 12,000-year-old stone is pretty precious.
I think so.
All right, I think that wraps up our questions. I do have a couple of announcements if people are still hanging on. I
There
do
seemed to be.
thank you all for hanging out with us. I do want to make an announcement about our next green drinks. We will be welcoming a soil scientist and community farmer and non-binary nature enthusiast, Nateo Carreño, to present Nature Beyond the Binary. The program will examine social, cultural, and scientific understandings of gender and explore the diversity of biological expression in the natural world, with hopefully some extra special details about some plants and things that are found in our area. So that will be on the first Thursday of June, which I believe is the 6th, at same time as we went live today, 6:30. And the other big event that Save the Dunes has coming up is our annual Save the Dunes 5K, the Dunes Dash, which is really exciting, happening in a new location this year at West Beach in partnership with the National Park. So that will happen on Saturday, June 22nd. Right now, registration is live, and we encourage people to sign up early to secure your commemorative tee and maybe grab a couple of friends and get some, get a group to run or walk on the 5K. It actually does the trail or the route for the 5K actually does go up the Dune Succession, also known as the Three Dunes Challenge or the Diana of the Dunes Challenge. So if you want to go embody and with Diana of the Dunes, feel free to join us for that, and I can drop a couple of the links to the registrations for those as well. I definitely encourage everyone to sign up for our e-newsletter. That's the best way to stay in touch with Save the Dunes, and pretty much, we work so closely with partners and we like to uplift what other people in the area are doing. So the newsletter is just a really great way to kind of stay on the heartbeat of the Indiana Dunes. If that's something that's important to you and the work that we do is important to you, that's the best place to go. Yeah. Otherwise, I think that will wrap us up for the evening. So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you so much, Ken. I loved your presentation. I feel like I continue to learn so much from Northwest Indiana Green Drinks presenters that there's never, not something to learn about here in this area. All right. Well, thank you all so much. Hope you have a good evening.
And thank you for the invitation.
Of course. Thanks so much, Ken.